Let's see what Norman Brennan thinks about this. So Norman Brennan is a regular on Talk, a former police officer and director of the Law and Order Foundation. Norman, thanks for joining us on Talk.
Yeah, good evening, Russell.
Yeah, good evening. I don't know if you heard what Trevor Kavanagh had to say. I mean, do you think that that's a measure that could work to try and stem the rising tide of knife and gun crime in London and Britain?
I don't know, where do we start? In fact, I wrote, that Trevor may recall, just after I retired from the police about 12, 13 years ago. I think we spoke, Trevor. I certainly emailed you, and I told you that the criminal justice system is in such a state that we're heading towards an epidemic of lawlessness on Britain. Well, here we are tonight meeting again, and that's exactly what's happened. Will that work? I don't know. We seem to have streets that are lawless. We don't have police officers on the streets. There's not enough police officers. Victims don't have their crimes investigated. The public don't see the police walking the streets, so they don't feel very safe. And just to sort of take you back on this one, Russell, it all started perhaps just about the time I left the police, 2009, 2010. Theresa May under David Cameron, along with Sir Tom Windsor, who was knighted as a result of helping cripple the police, reduced frontline officers by almost 22,000 officers, 27,000 backroom staff. So you had few police officers doing less, or doing more with less, plus they had to backfill. And it was then that the criminal element took over the streets of Britain. And sadly, frontline police officers have not been able to regain the streets now, and we're still far from it. And the 20,000 officers that Boris Johnson said that we desperately needed were only 20,000 of the 22,000 we needed back.
Yeah.
But all 5,000 of them have already resigned. Thousands more are looking to get out. I'm afraid I've not got good news. The future is absolutely dire. And I'm telling you now, 45 years as a leading law and order campaigner, 31 years as policing, we've got at least 10 years of absolute hell left. And I'm sorry.
Norman, stay there just one second. You might remember Boris Johnson in the 2019 Conservative manifesto talking about employing an extra 20,000 police officers, which sounded very, very good as a headline. The Conservatives say that they have actually achieved that, but of course what they don't tell you is that they lost 9,000 police officers through natural retirements and sickness and so on in the meantime. So the 20,000 wasn't 20,000 at all. But Labour have announced over the last 24 hours, Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, what their plans are to effectively be the party of law and order. Stay there for a second, Norman. I just want to show you this clip.
After 14 years of Conservative government, 90% of crimes go unsolved. There are 10,000 fewer neighbourhood police and PCSOs on the beat. More criminals are let off. More victims are let down.
So, Norman, Yvette Cooper's going to solve Britain's crime epidemic?
I've heard the same stuff 40 years, 45 years, I've heard the same stuff. Who do you think, Russell, is more of an expert? I personally are so disenfranchised.
You, mate. You and Peter Blexley, frankly,
Yeah,
not politicians.
I met Peter the other day. 45 years I've been in law and order and policing. I've seen it, I've heard it. It rarely ever happens. And just to sort of go back on what we were just saying, is that due to the increase in population, we're 18,000 officers shorter. That's after recruiting the 20,000.
So, Norman, let me ask you this. Is it just a question of there being more police officers? Let's say that magically we could put an extra 20 or 30,000 net additional police officers on the streets of Britain tomorrow. Would that solve the problem? Is the problem not a problem of wokery at the top of police forces, so that the likes of the Metropolitan Police that, you know, are not only in special measures, frankly, but famously woke, particularly with regard to what many of us consider to be two-tier policing of pro-Palestinian protests on a Saturday in central London? I mean, so is it just numbers? What else has to happen to remedy this problem?
No, not at all. The numbers would certainly help, but police must be allowed to police. If you're not allowed to police, then I'm afraid you could have 100,000 police officers. The criminal justice system fails the police and victims and the public daily. We've got police chiefs that are absolutely clueless on leadership. As you rightly highlighted, I was going to say the same as you: weak, woke, weary, out of touch, no vision, no passion, no direction. They live in a different world. They're detached from frontline police officers and the public. And then when we talk about if we had those police officers, Russell, all we've ever heard of is that we're going to crack down on gun crime, knife crime, burglaries. All shoplifters will be arrested. A new offence of assaulting a shop assistant. We don't need that. What we want is offences where the criminal justice system will back the police and they will back the public. Well, as I just explained to you, all of these crackdowns, if everything is a priority, nothing becomes a priority. And when you tell the public and victims, as the Prime Minister or Home Secretary or Shadow Home Secretary or Keir Starmer, we're going to do this, that and the other, we're going to crack down on all these crimes, then you hear that the prisons are full. Then you hear that prisoners that were sent to prison
and diktats, Norman, from government only 3 or 4 days ago saying that we should go easy, or the police should go easy on arresting people because they can't handle them from a resource perspective. Now, we've been talking about the lack of prison spaces in Britain for, the last 15, 20, 30 years. Why hasn't anybody had the common sense to just build more prisons? I mean, what is so difficult about that? And frankly, I'm not one for raising tax. I'm one personally of a low tax society. However, one of the things that I probably would agree to as an individual would be paying some kind of precept if it meant A, more police on the streets, and B, more prison places. And again, I'd love to know what the audience think about this, by the way. 0344 499 1000. Would you be prepared to pay a tiny bit more tax, maybe 1 pence in the pound, if it meant a guaranteed 20 or 30,000 police officers, guaranteed another 10 or 15,000 prison places? Because let me be frank with you, by the way, about what prison is. Prison is not just about rehabilitation. It's about the protection of the public. All this guff about, prison sentences under 1 year don't really work. I don't care, frankly. I don't care whether it works for that offender or not. What I care about is society, my friends, my family being protected from wrong-uns, frankly. Norman, do you agree?
Well, absolutely. The reason why people are sent to prison is to punish, deter, reassure, and absolutely the rehabilitation is not necessarily the first part. It's to punish, deter and reassure the public. And the point I was just getting back there, Russell, is that if you make all of these promises, you're going to crack down, you say you may face this charge or this sentence, you might. What may and might means that you won't. And if you're releasing those that are in prison that are there because they're serious offenders or persistent offenders 70 days earlier, and then you tell people that we've got no room in prisons, then you tell the police not to arrest people that are likely to go to court and go to prison. All of the promises actually are nothing but hash. They're
Norman, do you think that the British public have lost the police have lost the consent of the public now?
Yes, they have. The public don't see the police on the streets. They don't feel reassured. They don't feel protected. They feel lost. The police, when they go and arrest shoplifters, which is rare now because they rarely ever turn up, they say to me, Norman, why waste an entire shift doing paperwork when we know that that the magistrates and judges are going to release them? And then when you look at knife offences, for example, knife crime is my expert subject, homicide, gun and knife crime. Look what happened last night on the streets of London. There was a drive-by shooting.
Yes, I'm just talking about it, and a 9-year-old girl injured.
A 9-year-old girl at this moment in time fights for life. One of the adults is he's got life-changing injuries.
Yeah.
Now, when you think if you carry a gun on the streets of Britain, you're going to get a mandatory sentence of a minimum of 5 years. Yet if you carry a knife, where you're more likely to be stabbed to death 3 times than be shot to death, and sometimes the fine may be as low as that as a parking ticket. What message does that send out?
Well, I mean, look, we hear politicians and lobbyists talking a lot about how rules and laws need to be toughened, but there's already a law in place that says if you're caught for the second time carrying a knife, it's a mandatory prison sentence. About 80% of people that are caught for the second time, Norman, are not put in prison. So the law's already there. So, there's the police issue on one side, but of course a big issue with regard to the judiciary letting people off the hook too. Norman Brennan, thank you very much indeed. Wise words as ever.